Before we start tonight's video, I'm going to crack open a beer my girlfriend got me for my birthday. It's from Mile Wide. It's their special release R&D IPA batch number 1. And it'll go in my cool little Mazda pint glass that my friends Tim and Ashley got me for being a groomsman in their wedding. Alright, so today's video is going to be data driven, and it's going to compare my K04 stock turbo setup on my Speed 6 versus the 6266. So before I get started, I'll tell you a little bit about the stock turbo setup. This is basically how I picked up the car in February of 2020 when I bought it off of my friend Tim. It had stock turbo, of course, a CPE top mount intercooler, a HTP 3-inch intake, a Forge V2 bypass valve, a Corksport catless test pipe, stock downpipe, and a MagnaFlow exhaust when it comes to engine and exhaust modifications. So with this car was tuned by Freak Tune in November 2014, and I picked it up February 2020. This is a log from March 8th, 2020. So basically here you see I go wide open throttle at 2700 RPM. It's going to hit peak boost right around 4100 RPM, 18.7 pounds or so, and it holds that 18 psi till 5000 RPM. And you'll see here wastegate duty continues to climb all the way to 100%, but because of that little tiny hair dry over a turbo, it's only able to hold high 15 to 16 pounds of boost. Intake temp's about 79, so we'll figure that's probably 6 to 8 degrees above ambient temp. That's by the end of the pull, and it's moving roughly 269 grams a second of airflow at its peak, and that's right around the rev limiter at 6700 RPM. This was on 93 octane, so probably could have squeezed some more power out of it on E30 when it comes to adding ignition timing, so on and so forth. But up top, turbo's pretty much tapped out. It's running 100% wastegate duty, and is barely able to hold 16 pounds of boost. Now compare that to my 6266 setup. This is a log from the 12th, a couple days ago, 2021. I'm going wide open throttle at 2928 RPM. We hit 20 psi at 4000 RPM on the dot. 25 psi at 4990, 30 psi at 6600 RPM, and it carries that all the way to my rev limiter, roughly 7200 RPM or so. With this, obviously, because my MAF is scaled for port injection, we're looking at MAF voltage for airflow, and I'll get into that a little bit later. I'm going to show you guys a comparison to a log from my Speed 3 on a 5862 when it put down 575 wheel horsepower on a dyno jet. So comparing this, obviously I'm getting a lot more airflow with a Precision 6266 turbo. We're running 30 pounds of boost versus 18 peak. And it's a reverse taper where it's making peak boost up top versus peak boost in the mid-range or low end like the K04. But the funny thing is that I wanted to show you guys with this setup is the power band. So your green line here is the K04 graph, and the orange or reddish lines are my 6266. Engine mileage at the time of the green graph was roughly 60,000 miles, and we're at just over 81,000 miles and some change here on the high horsepower map. So everybody's always complaining about spool on larger turbos. Obviously that's important if you're driving through the twisties, doing autocross, city driving like a maniac. But what I wanted to point is from basically 3800 on up, the 6266 is making more torque, and from 4200 RPM on up, the 6266 is making more horsepower. And as you can see, it's able to carry that horsepower and torque all the way to 7200 RPM, whereas the K04 torque starts to die off after 4500 RPM, and horsepower peaks at 5000 RPM and starts to taper down. So if you ask me which one I'd rather drive, give me the fat power curve with all the area under the curve. You obviously have to relearn how to drive the car when you're running a bigger turbo setup. This log, I went wide open at 3000 RPM, and that's just for data purposes. If I'm driving on the street, I'm usually driving a gear down compared to how I would drive on the K04. So I'm usually cruising between the 3,000 and 4,000 range. And if I need to get on it and go, I can downshift it a gear. And the turbo actually lights up pretty quick. So the reason I wanted to show this is just to compare spool and the overall power output between the two setups, stock turbo and a ginormous Precision 6266. So now I'm going to show you guys a log from my Speed 3 that I used to have that had a built motor on a 5862, and then show you some virtual dyno stuff that I want to explain, because obviously when it comes to virtual dyno, a lot of people don't use it properly, and then there's variables like wheel spin, logging uphill, downhill, so on and so forth that affect what it puts out. So I'll show you a couple things and we'll get right to it. Enjoy my beer, and I'll see you guys in a bit. Alright, so this is a log from July 18th, 2018 on my 2007 Speed 3 that I used to have. It had a built motor, Precision 5862 journal bearing, turbo, CP exhaust manifold, a custom 3-inch downpipe, a CNT 3-inch catback, JMF with port injection, pretty much the entire turbo and fueling setup that I moved over to my Speed 6 that I now have, minus the downpipes different, but most everything else is the same aside from now running a stock block versus the built motor that was in this car. So this is actually a 5th gear pull, and the reason I did this was for traction purposes, so no wheel spin, and I'll get into why later when we talk about virtual dyno. But with this, I had no issues going wide open, super low RPM, 1 with the built motor, and 2 with how the boost curve was dialed to not put a whole bunch of load on the engine at lower RPM, and we'll get right into it. So wide open pull, 5th gear, 2300 RPM, going 48 miles an hour, hit 20 psi at 3974 RPM, .25 psi at 4600 RPM, 30 psi at 5400 RPM, 35 psi at 6000 RPM, and it pretty much held 35, 36 psi to my 7,300 RPM rev limit. And in 5th gear, that was 152 miles an hour on a 26-inch tire. I was running a 255 50/16 Toyo R888 on Mazda RX-7 FD wheels at the time. So the reason I wanted to show you guys this log is this is the same intake that I'm running on my Speed 6 right now. And on my Speed 6, I'm hitting, depending on the temperatures, 4.35 to 4.41 math volts up top. So, same intake, hitting those same voltages. My Speed 3 put down a verified 575 wheel horsepower, 467 pound-feet of torque. Obviously I'm more boost, but a smaller turbo. Granted, I'm tapering in the boost in a lot slower on my Speed 6 since it is a stock engine. But when it comes to peak power, being a front-wheel drive car with less drivetrain loss, I made 575 at 4.4 volts, whereas my Speed 6 is in that same max voltage range, putting down 520, 530 on virtual dyno. And the difference there is drivetrain loss, spinning that drive shaft plus the rear wheels. So with this log, I'm going to cut back to my camera so I can show you a couple other things when it comes to virtual dyno. And the reason I want to talk virtual dyno is the way people use it. Like I mentioned earlier, wheel spin, logging downhill or uphill is going to play a big role in what virtual dyno spits out. So obviously it can be misused as a tool, and it could spit out numbers that are way too high or way too low compared to what the car is actually making. So a couple things I do when I log is, 1, I try to find the flattest road possible. 2, I always log going eastbound or northeast. So that way I'm not going into a headwind. Wind typically flows east to northeast depending on where you are in the country on a normal day. So I'm avoiding going into a headwind. If anything, I have a tailwind, so it might inflate the numbers a tiny bit. 2, being on a flat road, I'm not skewing the numbers to where if I was going downhill, it's going to spit out a higher number. If I'm going uphill, it's going to spit out a lower number. And then the reason I did this particular pull in my Speed 3 and 5th gear was to avoid any wheel spin. If you have any wheel spin in a log, you're going to see a big spike in the graph. And obviously with my Speed 6, I really don't have to worry about that. I can hook 3rd gear in the rain, no problem. 4th gear, I'm never going to spin the tires unless there's an issue with the all-wheel drive system. So there's a lot of variables that go into play. And then with virtual dyno also, I use, and this is the typical correction factor for Mazda speeds, is the 1.01 correction factor. That's what people have found in the past, going back to days of actual forums, mazdaspeedforums.org and now mazdaspeeds.org. The dynojet correction factor on virtual dyno, at least for the speed platform, reads high. If you're at a normal elevation, when I was living in Northeast Ohio, I was between 700 and 1,000 foot above sea level. Now here in Louisville, Kentucky, I'm about 450 foot above sea level. So using that 1.01 correction factor and smoothing of 3, as long as I'm logging on a flat road, not hitting any bumps, not getting any wheel spin, virtual dyno is actually pretty accurate. So I will edit in a couple comparisons here. I'm going to show you a virtual dyno of this log in 5th gear on my Mazda Speed 3. And I will show you the actual dyno graph printout from the dynojet at Backstreet Performance in Medina, Ohio. And show you how damn close they are. in terms of power and torque output. I think horsepower was off by 4 horsepower, and torque was off by less than 5 as well. So I'll show you that here in just a sec. Alright guys and gals, that's going to be it for today, or tonight. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hopefully this video is a little useful to you. And I'll be back soon with some videos. And then hopefully sometime later this month, we'll be going live with my buddy Mark Gibson, who's still back in Northeast Ohio. And we're going to talk a little bit about Mazda speeds, a little bit about the LTG platform, the 2-liter turbos that are in the Cadillac ATS and the newer Camaros. And we'll drink some good beer and have some fun virtually with each other since we don't live right down the street from each other anymore. All right, see ya.